Hello, congregation. I invite you to turn with me in your Bibles once again to Galatians chapter 4, and I will read verses 4 through 7. Galatians 4, this is page 1791 in the Pew Bible, verse 4. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Dear congregation, we live in a society that's enslaved to the approval of others. And this is one reason our culture is so obsessed with social media. Because we are enslaved with the approval of others. Many of us are desperate to be known. We want our lives to be significant. And so we turn to social media to try and get a sense of meaning and affirmation. We want to know that we matter. And this is a real crisis. I mean, even secular scholars recognize this is a crisis in our world right now, social media and all of this. But it is such a crisis because as a society, we've bought into secularism, which offers no sense of meaning. I mean, if we are just dust, then there's nothing objective that makes humanity special. And if we buy the secular worldview, then life just goes through cycles of randomness. We came from nothing and we're going nowhere. And the more you repeat that to yourself, the more you drink that water, I mean, it gets pretty bleak. And so we need to look for meaning elsewhere. And so one way we do that, we put our life out there into the public sphere so that people can validate us. We long for significance. And yet here's the problem. Social media in itself isn't wrong, of course. But if we are looking to be validated that way, then we give people tremendous power. In fact, we become their slave. If they like the picture or post, my sense of worth goes up. And if they dislike, or just maybe even worse, there's just silence, I post something, there's nothing, then my sense of worth goes down. They're the master, I'm the slave. It's a form of slavery. Now imagine you were freed from all of that, because it's not just the world, it's us too. We live in a bondage often of approval of others. But imagine you were freed from all that. Freed from this ache to find significance, and freed not because you've checked out or because you're numb to it all, but freed because you found lasting approval from a far more significant source. You've discovered what it is to truly be known to the core, known not just on a surface level of a picture of you smiling at a happy second in the midst of 24 hours in a day where the rest is turmoil, not known in that way, but truly known. Like the depths of your being known fully, and yet known with a love that won't let you go. That's what this text is holding out to us. And that's what Christmas holds out to us. In doing so, the Christian message offers us something that not only does secularism not offer us, but no other religion offers us this. Christianity alone offers assurance to those who embrace Christ, assurance that we are fully known and fully loved. I mean, compare that to any other religion. Every other religion keeps you guessing. Have I done enough to qualify? Have I performed enough or well enough? Have I met the standard? Well, I hope so, maybe. That's the best another religion can offer you. I hope so, but I won't know until I face my Maker. Every other religion, then, is a form of bondage, too. Slavery is the best they can offer. Maybe you can be a servant of Allah or something like it, but servanthood is the best you can get. And Christianity is so different. Notice it offers assurance of love that's not based on our performance. But the more this assurance of love based on another's performance in my place is grasped, the more it truly changes me. And that's what this text holds out. Just to help you understand what's happening here, Paul is speaking to the church in Galatia. He had preached the gospel there, but now due to false teachers, those who had heard Paul preach the gospel, chapter 3, verse 1 tells us he preached it so vividly, it was like they were seeing Jesus crucified in their presence. But those who had heard that gospel were now slipping away from Christ back into bondage, into slavery, because of this subtle thought that maybe having Jesus isn't enough. And so I need to slip in some bit of my performance to just bolster my chances with the judge of heaven. And beloved, Paul gives them this text that's about the Christmas mission to remind them of the true gospel. And so that's our title, The Christmas Mission. And we have 4 points, and each point shows us not only how dazzling the Christian message is, but also how practical this familiar Christmas story is for living the Christian life. So the Christmas mission is our title. We have 4 points. First of all, the timing. And if your Bible's open, it'll help you certainly to look at our text, verse 4, and you'll see there the timing. Notice how it begins. When the fullness of the time had come. Now, to help you feel just what we're getting at here and how practical this is, when's the last time that subtle thought came into your heart? Is God in control? I mean, does God really have a plan? We're often tempted to ask those questions, and the reason is quite simple. I see my life, or I see someone else's life, and it looks like a mess. And so how can God be in control? How can God have a plan? Well, congregation, the first thing we're seeing here is that Christmas teaches us that God is in control, and Christmas teaches us God has a plan. How? Well, verse 4, when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son. And what we're noticing here is the timing. Paul is saying Christmas happened at the perfect timing. At the perfect moment in history, God sent forth his Son, which right away tells us there is a plan. Someone has a clock, and everything is happening right on time, at least according to his timetable. And so what that means is that as you look at your Bible, it's this morning we were looking at the first chapter of the New Testament, Matthew, but you notice that before Matthew, you got a pretty thick Bible. That's the Old Testament. And this text is telling us on every page of the Old Testament, you can write, God has a plan. God is in control. And then read the page. And it sounds like God doesn't have a plan and God's not in control, because it sounds like a mess. And yet over it all, we need to know God has a plan, God is in control. Just think for a moment, though, of the messy history that these pages contain. These are pages about real people with real lives. Think of Abraham and Sarah. I mean, what a long, winding journey of faith they went on. Many promises that God gave them, but many years of silence. Many stumblings into sin and disobedience. And yet this text is telling us over their whole life, God has a plan and God is in control. Did it always feel like it? No, absolutely not. Or think of Joseph. What evil he endured, what oppression he faced. And yet his good father had a plan, and his good father was in control. For years, it didn't feel like it. But by faith, we see him, and we see him just glowing as an example of faith. By faith, though it doesn't feel like God has a plan, though it doesn't feel like God is in control, he's trusting it. He's trusting him. And in the end, on his deathbed, he couldn't see the whole plan, but he could see more of the plan. I mean, you flip a little further in the Old Testament, and you find these tumultuous times of the judges. I mean, read the stories of the judges. It sounds like a disaster is happening in God's covenant community, and it is. And yet on those pages too, God has a plan, and God is in control. The days that followed continued to be dark. There were kings, most were wicked, the nations torn apart. The nation then, on account of their sin, is driven away from home into the exile. That's the unthinkable. We've gotten our land. The Lord's given us the land through the conquest of Joshua. We've come home. There's even a temple in our midst. It symbolizes God's presence among us. It looks so permanent. Look at these stones of the temple. Nothing's going to remove this. And then it's all removed. And they're shipped off 700 miles away. And over those chapters, God has a plan. God is in control. They come back home and things look bleak. The second temple doesn't compare to Solomon's. There's weeping on the day where it should be rejoicing. And then God goes silent. 400 years of silence from the last Old Testament prophet to the New Testament. And while God goes silent, the world whirls on. I mean, Persia, it falls to the Greeks. Out of nowhere, Alexander the Great comes, he conquers the world, and then just as quickly, his strength is snuffed out. Then up rises Rome, replacing Greece as the world power, and all along, the promises of God seem to be growing dusty and brittle. And then at the perfect time, it's like the clock in heaven chimes, and God acts in the most wonderful, earth-shaking way. When the fullness of the time has come, God sent forth his Son. Practical lesson number one of Christmas is that the good, sovereign God is in control. He has a plan. And friend, I wonder, how do you need that lesson today? Think about your life. Can you believe it? God has a plan. God's in control. Dear Christian, do you find yourself losing heart? Losing faith, maybe it feels like, even in God? At one time, you look back and you were certain he had a plan for your life. You were certain he was leading you. Everything just looked like straight lines. The dots were connecting. But now you're not so sure anymore. You don't see straight lines. It doesn't seem to make sense. I can't see how this is leading anywhere good. Well, the real Christmas story is just what you need. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. Because in the mess of it all, it's telling you, don't expect to be able to make sense out of things. I mean, open your Old Testament, and do you see straight lines? Or do you see tangled messes? I see a lot of circling in the wilderness for 40 long years. I see a lot of trouble, a lot of King David running, the anointed one, with all the promises, anointed, all these promises, you're going to be the king, and then the years running for his life. That's the pattern, actually, suffering and then glory. Through it all, God was working. And so, dear friend, waiting on this Lord is always worth it. It's hard, and yet today, don't stop waiting on him. Right now, whatever that right now is the ideal moment to trust him. This is the time to trust him. You need this God, and if you trust him, in the end, you'll see he was trustworthy all along, just like this text tells us. When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son. His plans always come through. That's the first thing, the timing. Second, notice the Son. The Son. Christmas, it's such a wonderful story, true story, such a wonderful story that it teaches us the truth about God. Here's why I love the Christmas story, and I hope you love the Christmas story. Again, I'm all for you being just Christmas season. I'm tired of it. I'm done with it. That's okay. The Christian doesn't need to love all the glitz and glamour that goes around with it. I mean, there's good opportunities for fellowship. There's good opportunities to sing like we are tonight. That's great. There's good opportunities for family. All that's good. But even that can be painful. So you don't need to love all of those things. The thing to love is the real meaning of Christmas. And one thing to love about this story is it just smashes through our idols. It smashes through all of our false views of God. And we're so good at making them. Calvin was certainly right. My heart, your heart is like that factory that just keeps pumping out idols, our own creations of what we think God is like, and then Christmas comes along and smashes it again. Here's what I mean. Let me just highlight two things about God that the Christmas story tells us. First, we see the generosity of the Father. The generosity of the Father. Again, is that what your idolatrous heart, is that what my idolatrous heart naturally crafts God into being? The generous giver of every good and perfect gift. Certainly my heart doesn't go there. But look at the text. We see the generous Father. And when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son. And notice this language then. With the gift that's being given, we notice that he is God's Son. This is the divine Son of God, the eternal Son of God. And the language that Paul uses is so critical. Because Paul doesn't say, when the fullness of the time had come, God had a son. As if the gift he was giving was just the creation of a moment. It doesn't also say, when the fullness of the time had come, God adopted a son. It's not like he's looking in his created realm and he says, okay, I see Mary, she will do, and her womb will do, and I'll just adopt that womb, put an embryo there, and then now a creature is going into this world. An adopted creature. No, that's not what the text says. The text tells us, when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his treasure, his Son. The Son who existed from all eternity. The one who is always with God, who is God himself, the second person of the Holy Trinity, the one who is the eternal joy and delight of the Father. Congregation, we cannot tire of thinking of the joy that exists in the Godhead, because the more we think of the love between the Father, Son, and Spirit, the more Christmas glows. It just radiates. Because that love then is coming down at Christmas. That love is being sent forth into Christmas. And as you read the gospel, you notice the Father has this consistent message that he keeps pronouncing over his Son. And he keeps saying this is my well-beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Oh, I am so satisfied in him. That's what eternity has been like for the Father as he's rejoiced in the Son. And the Father sent him. Can you believe it? To you, to us, to this world, his greatest treasure. I mean, when I see a text like this, it just does a number on the idols of my heart. God as that cold, distant deity that he is, and just out to take our stuff. All of that is smashed to smithereens when we come to a text like this. When the fullness of the time had come, the generous Father gave the sin-stained world his beloved Son. Oh, friend, don't you need your views of God corrected? Well, here it is in this text. That's the generous Father. But notice also the humility of God the Son. The humility of God the Son. Look at what Paul goes on to say. When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman. And this here is the amazing event that we celebrate at Christmas. The stunning moment where the infinite Creator didn't lose any of his godness, but took to himself a finite nature. He added it to his divine nature in his one person. And so what a wonderful mystery the incarnation is. If this doesn't lead us to worship and to wonder, I don't know what will, because just think about this. The Bible tells us that the Son, Hebrews 1:3, the Son, God the Son, upholds all things by the word of his power, his powerful word. He upholds all things, and as he's doing that, he is being held in the arms of his mother. Can you conceive of what this means? As he kept tireless watch over his world, Psalm 121 is referring to him. He is God. Psalm 121, he never slumbers, he never sleeps. As he's keeping watch over his world, he drifts off to sleep in his manger. This is the wonder of the incarnation. And behind it, we see the humility of God. Does that even ring as coherent in your ears? I mean, if we're left with the God of our own imagination, then it won't. And yet Philippians 2, verse 5, Paul says, contemplate the humility. And then he goes on to describe the Son of God, humbling himself, stooping to become a creature, the king becoming a subject. And so here's what this does. When we think we've got a grip on something of God's transcendence, as soon as I think, oh, I know him in the vastness of his greatness and glory, then my mind needs to remember the baby in the manger. And then as soon as I think I have a grip on his humility, I need to remember, here's the God of the universe. And that leads you to wonder and worship. This baby, at the moment that he's laying in his manger, he's giving life to the Herod who wants to kill him. In him we live and move and have our being. And so, congregation, if you don't stagger at the mystery of the incarnation, you don't have your ears open. Jesus is true God. He's eternal God. He's the maker and keeper of the universe. And he really added to himself a real human nature. And I mean a real human nature. Just like any baby, he had his share of snotty noses and dirty bums. Do you dare to say that about him? If not, you don't have a real picture of his humanity. He became real human. And that should shock your view of God then. He would do this? He would humble himself like this? Why would he do this? Why would he subject himself to these limitations? We'll get to that in a moment, but notice there's still more. Paul says, not only was he born of the woman, but he was born under the law. And just think about what that means. The same demands of the law that hangs over all of us as humanity, maybe the law that we kick against and we say, God, it's not fair that you want me to have no other gods before you. I mean, that's pretty reasonable. He made us. Okay, it's not fair that I shouldn't murder. Oh, that one's pretty reasonable too. The law is very reasonable. It's for our good, though we kick against it, yet he himself came under it to show us the goodness of it. Look at what a life looks like when you live according to the law. Well, look at Jesus. But what humility, the king subjecting himself to his law. And unlike sinful humanity who's constantly failed to love our God and to love our neighbor, this true man proved himself to be the law keeper. He kept the law. And that's an important part of his life. He came to fulfill all righteousness. This Son did what was always pleasing to the Father, and he did it. This is where it's like we have the dimmer switch, and now we're starting to turn the dial. Here's where the wonder starts to glow. He did all of this for sinners. He lived a perfect life for sinners. And as we'll hear now in our third point, the mission, he also died for sinners. So our third point, the mission. Our title is The Mission, the Christmas Mission. And I chose that because of the words that Paul uses here. Notice verse 4, when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth. It's those words that we're zeroing in on right now. Sent forth, it carries the idea of this one whom God is sending, his beloved Son. He has been commissioned for a specific mission, and now he's been sent out. Hebrews 3 refers to Jesus as an apostle. What does that mean? Well, apostle means sent one. He is the one that the Father has sent out. And again, the Father hasn't entrusted anyone else with this mission. He entrusted his beloved Son, the one whom he knows is qualified, who does a perfect job. He sent him. And the mission that he sent him to complete just radiates with good news to sinners. It's found in verse 5. Here's the mission. Here's the Christmas mission: to redeem those who were under the law. That's why God sent his Son. That's why God gave the greatest gift. He gave him for this purpose, to redeem those who were under the law. Now, this word redeem, obviously, it's a key word that we need to look at here, and it would have been familiar to the ears of Paul's audience. It brings to mind something very familiar. In every market square, in every city, in every town in the ancient world, there was the slave market. And there, slavery was a huge part of the economy. And so many people, even some people, would willingly sell themselves into slavery to enable themselves to have a permanent, care and a job and all of that. They could be treated well sometimes. Sometimes they were treated terribly, of course. But the idea here, redeem, it brings to mind the slave market. And to redeem someone was to take money and to pay the price for the slave, to purchase their freedom. And just remember the context of what Paul has been writing about in Galatians. Here have been those who have heard the gospel of Christ, who've heard the wonderful freedom that the gospel gives, and they've been tempted to slip back into slavery, into bondage. And Paul brings this idea to mind. He's saying, look, the whole Christmas story, the whole reason God sent forth his Son was to redeem those who were under the law. Now, congregation, this implies something of us by nature. It implies that we need redeeming. It implies that we, by nature, are slaves, and not just slaves to anything, but slaves to sin. That's what Jesus would have us know in John 8. And it's our heavy chains of sin that keep us from being able to crawl our way back to God. Naturally, we're enslaved to our dark desires, so that our dark desires have become twisted. Not that we want to go back to God. No, we're forever bound and bent on hating God, and even as we do so, we're destroying ourselves. While many can give the impression that we're all just innocent seeking after God, the Bible tells us the truth. None seek after him. Why? Because we're enslaved by nature to our sin. Friend, have you ever felt that before? Have you ever felt the chains of sin? Maybe a certain behavior in your life is wrong, and even you don't like it, and yet as you go to fight it, you can't stop it. At one point, you thought you were in control, you could manage the sin, but you just wanted to keep it in its proper place, and then one day, it's like you wake up and you realize you can't actually stop it. And that's what happens with sin. It fools us into thinking that we are its master when it all along has had us by the throat. By nature, we are slaves to sin. We can't break ourselves free. And beloved, this is why God sent forth his Son. To redeem those who were under the law. Now, when it says under the law, it has the idea of, well, not only are we enslaved to sin, but we're enslaved now to the law's demands, the wages of sin, which is death. And how do we escape that? Sin has brought on this whole other bondage. We're bound by this. The wages of sin is death. The law will be satisfied. It must be satisfied. And so where can we go? Well, the Lord is saying, come and see my Son. He was sent forth to redeem those who have broken the law, who have sinned, and who now deserve the wages of death. And beloved, this word redeem, it has, as I said, that idea of payment. Redemption always involves payment. And so what's the payment? Well, the payment is the whole point of God sending his Son. He sent him to live that perfect life. That's part of the payment. You need a perfect life. If you're ever to stand in the presence of God, you need to have a righteousness that's perfect, clothing you. But you also need to have died for your sin. Your sin deserves death. And that's why Jesus came. He came to die in the place of sinners. You probably don't even need to turn the page, but if you look at Galatians 3, verse 13, Paul uses the same word to highlight the wonderful death of Christ. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. How? By having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. That's what's happening at the cross. God is there pronouncing his curse on his beloved Son. Because Jesus there is wearing the garments of my sin, owning it so fully as if he had lived this way. And so he's dying the death that sinners deserve. Friend, have you come to marvel at the wonder of Christmas? Where do you go with your guilt? Our world is burdened with guilt. Social media is burdened with guilt. Once you get canceled, where do you go? You can never say you're sorry enough. What happens next? You shun them forever. Their reputation's ruined. There's no forgiveness. There's no way back. Your life can be ruined in a moment. Your reputation can be ruined in a moment. The gospel is about a way back. God sent forth his Son so that there would be a way back, so that there really is forgiveness, that all of my pride, all of my anger, all of my lust, my bitterness, my idolatry, my self-centeredness, my complaining, my time wasting, and a host of other sins will be dealt with in full. That's the wonder of Christmas. So that you could stand before God, knowing with assurance these are dealt with in full. That takes us to the final thing, the purpose. The purpose. Why would God do this? The answer is almost unbelievable. I dare you to look at the end of verse 5. It's almost unbelievable. It should make us jump for joy. Why would God do this? Why would the Son endure this? Why would the Father be so generous to sinners? When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. This is the goal of the Christmas mission. God wanted to take children of wrath and to make them children of God. that we might receive the adoption as sons. Now maybe you think, well, why sons? And if you're a woman, you might think, well, I just wish Paul would stop being so misogynistic. He's saying sons, how can I wear this? And yet it's not Paul being sexist or anything like that at all. Actually, in the Roman culture, the eldest son had the best inheritance. And so it's like Paul's ears are particularly open to the woman here and is saying, I want every believer, including the women who are believing in Christ, to know that in God's family, there's not a second class. You get the best inheritance too. You get the inheritance of the firstborn. It's a gloriously wonderful thing. In a culture where women were routinely overlooked, Paul is wanting them to know God won't overlook you. Even you get the adoption as sons. You get the prized inheritance. But notice there's more to it than that. Paul's language also reminds us of the shape of salvation and how necessary this is for us, because many of us are so just comfortable separating Christ from salvation. Meaning we think of salvation as, okay, here comes Christ and he's holding this gift called salvation. And yet what we need to realize is that salvation is actually us sharing in him. Us getting him. The gospel is Christ. He doesn't just give us a gift. He is the gift. Which means you get everything that is his. So notice verse 7 then. Therefore, you're no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then listen to this, an heir of God through Christ. Not apart from Christ. Not Jesus has mail delivered this thing called sonship. No, sonship comes through the Son. Being united to him. By faith, being one with him now. And so the point is that as the second Adam, Christ is God's firstborn son of the new creation. So Adam was the firstborn son of God. Luke 3 talks that way. Of this creation. Christ is the firstborn son of the new creation. And in him, every believer is adopted. And so every believer, male or female, can say, my salvation and my sonship is through God's Son. And when I start to realize that, what security that gives in my soul. Because the only way I will ever lose my legal status as son is if Jesus loses his. And that's an impossibility. That's why I don't want to separate my salvation from Christ. I am one with him. I am as securely in the presence of the Father as he is. And yet, dear believer, it gets even better. The Father wants you to enjoy your status. And so he's gone even further. Look at verse 6. Because you are sons, God sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your heart, crying out, Abba, Father. And so you see the picture? The Father sent his Son on the mission into this vile world to save sinners, and then the Father sends his Spirit on a mission into his people's vile hearts to assure them of that salvation. He is so eager to relate to his people, not merely as their master, but as their Father. That's the Christmas mission. And is that your view then of God? Beloved, we're so slow to believe it. In fact, it's much easier to believe that we are just his servants. Let me bring us to a close with a well-known parable that Jesus told us. It's the parable of the prodigal son. Do you remember what he said as he was returning in his filth? He's still wearing his clothes. He's filthy. He's returning his filth to his father. Remember what he said as he walked home? He's reciting to himself, I'm no more worthy to be called the son. Just make me like one of your hired servants. And dear believer, we think that that sounds humble, and so we talk that way to God. And yet, you know what? Our Father won't put up with it because it actually expresses very low views of him. We don't think he's generous enough or gracious enough to really forgive us and really gift to us the gift of sonship. And so we go through life merely like a worker, make us a hired servant, let me earn my keep. It sounds pretty good, and yet it's pride and it's unbelief. Because I'm saying, Father, just put me on the payroll and let my performance be a part of how I relate to you. When the Father is saying, no, my Son is how you relate to me, in and through him. And so, dear Christian, Christmas, it frees you. It frees you from needing to seek approval from others, because I have the approval of the Father. And it's a secure approval. The Father doesn't just allow the Son to say, I'm a servant. He runs to him and has compassion on him, and he clothes him, and he put a ring on his finger. All of that is indicating for him and for others, you're not a servant, you're my son. And then the Father kisses him. And let me ask you this question, Christian. Will you let your Father kiss you this Christmas? By allowing yourself to rejoice in the fullness of what Christ has done for you. To allow yourself to say, it is true. He accepts me because of the Son. And as your heart goes out to him, then know it's the Spirit who's stirring up these cries, Abba, Father. And the Spirit is saying, listen to those cries and have all the more assurance that you are a son. Well, may this be all of our experience. Amen. Psalter 297 is what we want to sing out of response. Psalter 297, notice it's